Hello world, my name is Dr. Shaham Das and I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I live and work in London and this is my podcast, A Psych for Sore Minds. Thank you for listening. I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders, or what the media might call the criminally insane. I work in courts and in prisons and in special psychiatric secure units that are reserved for the most dangerous and violent patients. Although I specialise in criminal psychiatry, I've got expertise in most aspects of mental health. I've got a whole host of stories that I'd like to share with you about a range of cases and psychiatric illnesses. This specific episode is about a horrific case that you've probably heard of. The perpetrator is a young man called Jonty Bravery, who's now 18. And on the 4th of August 2019, Mr. Bravery randomly threw off a young French boy at the Tate Modern Museum in London. Mr. Bravery had severe mental health issues, including autism, hence making this a case that would require a forensic psychiatrist expert witness. I'll also be telling you about other fascinating similar cases within this episode, including other people with autism who've committed violence who I have personally assessed. I will make sure that all the cases are anonymised out of respect for all the people involved in the case. So that's like the perpetrators, the victims, the families, etc. And I'll use my expertise and experience to comment on specific medico-legal questions in areas that would have been examined during the criminal court trial in this particular case. This video podcast series will explore a range of topics related to mental health, some associated with violence, but some not. And I'll also talk about criminality in general. This podcast is meant for the layperson who's interested in learning a bit more about severe mental illness. And I'll be giving you guys out there the perspective from a psychiatrist. Now, to be fair, there are lots of podcasts about anxiety, depression, and there's lots of stories about people that have overcome mental illness and moved on with their lives. Don't get me wrong, that's good. It's a good thing that those exist. But this podcast is something different. This will be more about severe, chronic, lifelong illnesses that impact on a sufferer's functioning, on their social status, and just their lives in general. So I'll be talking about disorders like schizophrenia, autism, obviously, or bipolar affective disorder, because these are the patients that I see every day in my clinical practice, and I think it's important that they also have a voice. As I said, this specific episode is about Jonty Bravery, who on the 4th of August 2019 randomly threw a young boy off a balcony in the Tate Modern Museum in London. This case first piqued my attention when it happened about a year ago, but also again more recently because he was all over the news in June of this year as he'd just been sentenced to 15 years in prison. Before we get into it, I should really give you a trigger warning. This case, like many of the others I might be discussing, is, it's horrific and it's tragic. That goes without saying. But also these cases are interesting, and I think they can help us gain an insight into the human psyche. Now, my sympathies go out to the victim in this case and his family. Look, I've got two sons, right, who are age 5 and 7. The victim was age 6, so I certainly can empathize. So forgive me if I talk about these cases kind of dispassionately, but I wanted this podcast to be educational and thought-provoking and about the technicalities, and to show you the legal and clinical perspective from a forensic psychiatrist, as opposed to a podcast that's like emotive and judgmental. So sit back and enjoy, and welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. It's August the 4th, 2019. Mr. Bravery leaves the supported accommodation where he's staying on unsupervised leave. It's a beautiful day in London, clear skies, no signs of rain, and only the occasional breeze. Mr. Bravery tops up his Oyster card that morning before hopping on the Underground to London Bridge. When he arrives at his station, which is Southwark, Mr. Bravery alights and makes his way to the Shard. Inside the entranceway, Mr. Bravery asks a member of staff about the entry prices, but he finds that he just doesn't have enough money. So he walks away, but then returns to ask for directions to the scene of his imminent crime. Just after 2 p.m, Mr. Bravery arrives at the Tate Modern and speaks to a member of staff before he takes the lift or the elevator up to the 10th floor to a viewing balcony. Mr. Bravery casually walks to the edge. He peers over the railings to examine the drop. Witnesses describe Mr. Bravery at this time as relaxed and also smiling at their children. Feeling that something was a bit off, some of them move away from this slightly strange, bizarre stranger on the balcony. Meanwhile, 10 floors below, a French family are stepping into the lift, and their 6-year-old boy is with them, and he's eager and excited to see the view. When the elevator door slides open at the top, the boy skips out onto the balcony ahead of his parents. He skips right into the arms of Jonty Bravery, who scoots him up and just unceremoniously hurls him over the railings to plunge 30 meters, about 100 foot, to what could have been his death. Witnesses describe Mr. Bravery raising his arms and smiling as he was being detained by members of the public. And those people stated that he seemed calm and he was lacking emotion, and he's heard saying, "It's not my fault, it's social services." And he's heard asking, "Is this going to be on the news?" The victim, this 6-year-old boy, suffers a bleed to the brain and has spinal fractures. He breaks his legs and his arms, and even to this day, he remains in a wheelchair needing constant care, and it's not clear if he will make a full recovery. Now that you've heard about what happened that fateful day, let's explore the legal and the psychiatric elements of this case together. We'll analyse and then we'll answer the ultimate question, which is this: should Mr. Bravery, or people in similar situations with similar mental illnesses, be held responsible for their criminal actions? First, let's explore the role of the forensic psychiatrist in this case. Mr. Bravery had a mental illness, and for that reason, this case needs to be assessed by a forensic psychiatrist to assist the court as an expert witness. And I just want to be clear, I wasn't the forensic psychiatrist that was directly involved in this case, although I have been involved in hundreds of others, a few of which have been similar, a couple of which I'll tell you about soon. In cases like this, forensic psychiatrists assess defendants, and we give judges advice about whether somebody's mental illness can be used as a psychiatric defense. The most well-known of those defenses is not guilty by reason of insanity, and I will talk you through the technicalities of these later on in this episode. Mr. Bravery was assessed at Broadmoor Hospital, where I used to work once as a registrar many years ago. Broadmoor is a high secure hospital and is one of the most notorious of its kind. Defendants like Mr. Bravery who end up in these hospitals have forensic psychiatrists like myself, as well as a whole multidisciplinary team who look after them and rehabilitate them. The consultant forensic psychiatrists at Broadmoor diagnosed Mr. Bravery with autism and a mixed personality disorder. So let's start off by talking about autism. What is autism? Autism is a developmental disorder, which means it's there from birth. And for the love of God, it is not caused by vaccines. Autism has 3 clusters of symptoms. I'll talk you through them all. They are social communication, social interaction, and restricted and repetitive behaviors. So for social communication, typically this is both verbal and non-verbal communication. So somebody who has autism may not understand spoken language, and they may not understand the subtleties of body language. So things like gestures, eye contact, facial expressions. And in terms of social interactions, they also can't recognize emotions and intentions in other people. And sometimes they can't even recognize them in themselves. So in some cases, they can actually understand the factual content of what somebody is saying, but they don't understand if that person's being like sarcastic or angry, or if the situation is tense or if it's escalating. So you can kind of understand how they might get themselves into sticky situations. And people with autism can't communicate. So when they get frustrated, they might lash out, and they might also easily get overwhelmed in social situations. In terms of their restricted and repetitive behaviors, these tend to be like either body movements like rocking or rubbing, or they tend to do ritualistic behaviors, and they also have quite a narrow or extreme interest in particular topics, often at the cost of ignoring things that are going on around them. So I want to make this absolutely clear, and I want to prophylactically inhibit any potential trolling, okay? The vast majority of people with autism are not aggressive and they're not dangerous, okay? But there are a cohort that are. And I know this to be the case because I've literally worked on units for exactly this type of patient with exactly this type of level of risk. Again, their aggression is not always intentional, but it is often related to the aforementioned symptoms and behaviors that are characteristic of autism. Sometimes their offending is related to the sufferer's inability to express their anger and their frustration. It's kind of comparable to a toddler who's acting out, but who's got the strength and the body of a full-grown adult. Another interesting aspect is that the newspaper articles that I've read stated that Mr. Bravery had a personality disorder. It doesn't actually say which type, and there are many different types of personality disorder, and one day, hopefully, I'll do a separate podcast about them. But very briefly, your personality is what makes you you, right? It's ingrained into you. It's shaped by your life experience. It's your characteristic patterns of thinking and feeling and behavior. And it affects how you manage your feelings, and it affects how you relate to other people. So when it's disordered, which is a personality disorder, then your personality leads to difficulties in how you think and feel about yourself and how you relate to others as well. So this can negatively affect the sufferer's well-being. It can affect their mental health, their relationships. In fact, it affects most aspects of their life, from socializing to achieving goals to functioning to working, everything. As I said, the papers don't mention exactly what type of personality disorder Bravery has, but my best guess is that it's likely to be antisocial personality disorder, which you may have heard of. So those are people who regularly offend, and they just have a disregard to the law and also to the rights and feelings of other people. And I know that Bravery had a history of aggression, including attacking the carers that worked with him. So that's why I've come to that particular conclusion. Now, I know everybody loves a juicy case, right? And I've given evidence in court for, I would say, about maybe 25 cases where autism has led to offending in a similar manner to Mr. Bravery. But I thought I'd pick out a couple of the more interesting cases. First up, it's Mr. G. So one of the cases that really sticks out in my memory is Mr. G. He was a man in his 40s who I saw in court, and he was on charges of stalking. He was relatively high functioning, but he was also quite isolated and marginalized. He didn't really have many friends, and I think he was aware of this kind of sense of just not quite fitting into society. And there was a young woman in the cafe who showed him some attention, just being friendly and nice. And I think this man unfortunately misinterpreted the social interaction, and he misjudged it as her fancying him, basically. So he started stalking her. He would come into the cafe, he would spend all day there, constantly trying to talk to her and asking her questions. He would follow her around. And she began to feel that his behavior was becoming quite, creepy, frankly. And eventually this escalated and he started following her home. Now, I don't think he had any intention of aggression, right? And there certainly wasn't any actual violence, and he wasn't unpleasant to her, but understandably, he was just freaking her out. And even when she had a non-contact order, which is a restraining order, taken out against him, his behavior just didn't subside. And I have to say that I felt sorry for Mr. G. I don't think what he was doing was coming from a place of malice. But the advice that I gave to the court, as it always has to be, was neutral and objective. I talked about Mr. G's lack of social reciprocity and how this led to him not quite understanding cues, even with the restraining orders. Next up is my story of Mr. F. It's similar, but a little bit more sinister, because this was a case of sexual touching. So I met a man in his mid-20s who'd been approaching lone females at bus stops. He'd also sexually propositioned a random woman who was pushing a wheelchair down the road. So she called the police and he was eventually arrested. And at the time, he was living in a specialist care home, and he was out on unescorted leave, which incidentally was exactly the same situation that Mr. Bravery was in when he committed his offence. Sorting out leave for psychiatric patients with histories of offending is another area that forensic psychiatrists are responsible for. So we have to figure out unescorted leave versus escorted leave with nursing staff, and when these patients can be out in public without being a danger to others. It's a balance of not restricting the patient too much, giving them some freedom, but obviously keeping the public safe. And there's lots of different factors that we have to consider. But again, I think that's for another podcast. So back to this young man who I saw, Mr. F. He was remanded to prison, and by the time I saw him, he'd already been transferred to a secure, locked psychiatric unit. And I'd been asked by the judge to assess his fitness to plead, which is a very specific medico-legal issue for a forensic psychiatrist. And my overall view was that Mr. F did know what he was doing to a degree, right? Because he was obviously targeting his victims, and his actions were intentional. They were purposeful. They were, goal-driven. But at the same time, I think they were related to his autism. So basically, what I thought and the evidence I gave to the court was that he had these natural sexual urges, but he couldn't quite express them or even, I think, deal with them or understand them in a healthy way. And I don't think he understood the full consequences of his behavior. So to expand, I think Mr. F knew what he was doing was wrong because, for example, he hid it from staff and he also denied it when he was challenged. But at the same time, I don't think he fully appreciated the impact that it had on his victims, because when myself and other psychiatrists assessed him, he couldn't really just understand the basic concepts. I found that Mr. F was not fit to plead. I thought that this young man superficially understood the criminal charges against him and what the prosecution was proposing, but he didn't really have the full cognitive ability to understand court proceedings. To give you an example, when I saw Mr. F, when I assessed him, he repeatedly kept asking me to tell the judge that he promised he wouldn't do it again and that the judge should just release him. And he couldn't really accept that it doesn't work that way. He didn't understand that he had to go through a formal trial. So in the end, he ended up staying in the unit where I saw him, and he was there for long-term rehabilitation, including psychological therapy and education. As a side note, I should point out that I've actually worked in these kind of care homes, in these wards that deal with people with severe learning disabilities, including autism, both as a psychiatrist, but also as like a carer, a part-time carer when I was a medical student. And I have to say, I applaud the carers that work in these environments because it's a very difficult job, right? You're trying to care for and support people with serious learning disabilities, some of whom can lash out, some of whom can become quite agitated. So you've got to keep yourself, the staff, and the other patients safe. But at the same time, you've got to try and kind of make it a homely environment because it is those clients' homes. So you have to try and make it fun and supportive. You've got to try and engage the patients in activities and hobbies. So yeah, very difficult job. Back to the podcast. Let's get back to the Mr. Bravery case. Next, we're going to talk about criminal culpability. So Mr. Bravery's defense team almost certainly would have at least considered whether or not he met the requirements for a psychiatric defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, I'm going to talk you through the legal criteria and then I'm going to dissect them in terms of their relevance to Mr. Bravery's case. The legal framework is known as the M'Naghten Rules, which are: this defense can be utilised if the defendant is proven to be suffering from a defect of reason which is caused by a disease of the mind, which I think in this particular case you could potentially argue is relevant for Mr. Bravery because he had autism. But also the mental disorder was such that the accused ought not to be held responsible for the act allegedly because either the defendant may not have known the nature and the quality of the act, right? Or he didn't know that the act was wrong, by which I mean legally wrong, not necessarily morally wrong. So these aren't just words, it's a very precise kind of minefield, and the judge will make his ruling following the law down to the last letter. So if the judge finds a ruling of not guilty by reason of insanity, then the defendant is technically innocent, so they could potentially walk. Although in a case as high risk and high profile as this, I think it's very likely that in that particular circumstance, Mr. Bravery would have been sectioned back to Broadmoor Hospital. And if the judge doesn't agree with this finding, then the defendant is guilty and he's sent to prison, which is exactly what happened in Mr. Bravery's case. As we know, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. So actually, this defense and the evidence that forensic psychiatrists give is a big deal. I mean, it makes a huge impact on the defendant's life. The court usually accepts the evidence given by a forensic psychiatrist. And if the opposing side, which is the Crown Prosecution Service, if they object, then they might even instruct their own forensic psychiatrist. And what happens then is that the two psychiatrists battle it out in court. They give evidence on the witness stand and they're cross-examined by judges, by their barristers. And I have to say, personally, this is by far my favourite part of my job. Now, as we know, Bravery wasn't afforded this defence, but I think it'd be interesting to explore why that was the case. I think a noteworthy factor is that it appears that he planned the killing. Okay, so Bravery researched ways to kill people on the internet before the incident. And as we know, he visited the Shard before he visited the Tate, seemingly because he wanted to throw somebody off the Shard. But as I said before, he couldn't actually afford the entrance price. Also, he even researched, are you guaranteed to escape prison if you have autism on the internet on the morning of the incident? But does pre-planning automatically indicate guilt? The answer to that is no, not quite. It's actually the thought process and the defendant's intentions during the offence, i.e., going back to the M'Naghten rules, whether he knew the nature and the quality of the act and if he knew it was wrong. But I don't think in this case you can say that Bravery didn't know the nature and the quality of the act, because what he did was clearly purposeful, it was goal-directed as opposed to, inexplicable or completely random. I also don't think you can say that he didn't know that the act was wrong, because afterwards he clearly stated that he wanted to be on the news, which to me, and hopefully to you, indicates that he knew what he was doing was legally wrong, because otherwise he wouldn't have garnered press attention, right? However, in another set of circumstances, even if Bravery was planning his actions, it doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't know what he was doing was legally wrong. I'll give you an example. So there's another case during which I gave evidence in court where a man with schizophrenia, let's call him Mr. H, was floridly psychotic because he'd not managed to collect his regular antipsychotic medication from his GP. And at the time he was suffering from hallucinations and delusions, and he was convinced that an ex-girlfriend of his was being tortured inside a flat that he used to live in. So at the time, Mr. H was hearing these nasty kind of hostile voices that were telling him that he was worthless and also that his girlfriend was in danger and she was about to be killed. So he planned to break into his old flat and rescue her. And it was pre-planned and organised. He took public transport, he planned out a route, he took tools with him to break in, and he broke into his old accommodation. He eventually kicked down the front door and he freaked out the old man who had lived there, and that man called the police, and shortly afterwards he was arrested. So despite the fact that Mr. H planned this, he convincingly explained to me that his thought process at the time was to save somebody else's life, his girlfriend. So he did manage to get the psychiatric defence of not guilty by reason of insanity based on the expert evidence as an expert witness that I gave during his trial. Now, obviously, in these kind of cases, I don't just take what the defendant says at face value. I don't just go on whatever they report. I have to look at all the available evidence. So that might be police interviews, witness statements, occasionally CCTV footage, anything that gives me clues about what their actual intentions and their mental states and behaviour was at the time. But what if I was wrong about Mr. H? And what if he got released, I hear you say? And what if Mr. Bravery won that defence and had been set free? Well, that's kind of a factor that I have to balance in every case when I'm asked to make this decision. And kind of reflecting on it, I suppose that the decisions we make as forensic psychiatrists, things like the defences of not guilty by reason of insanity, or, for example, deciding if somebody has to go to hospital or prison, it's kind of a balance, right? It's a balance between protecting the vulnerable, so that people who have mental illnesses, who don't have control of their actions, are not just imprisoned unfairly. But at the same time, it's also about protecting the public and keeping them safe. And it's also about justice for the victim. And that is why it's so important to figure out exactly what somebody's intentions are at the time of their offence, and whether their mental illness reduces their culpability or not. So this is why all the evidence has to be examined in forensic detail. It has to be corroborated from different sources. As I said before, police interviews, witness statements, CCTV. So if Bravery had got the finding of not guilty by reason of insanity, so for example, let's say that he was hearing voices that convinced him that he had to throw the French boy off the balcony to save his own life or to save the boy's life, or as another example, say he had a delusion that the boy was actually a demon and not a real boy, and he generally didn't believe he was harming another human. And by the way, I picked that obtuse example specifically because it's similar to another case that I've dealt with. Then Mr. Bravery might have got that defence. But as I said before, he wouldn't have walked. He would have been detained under the Mental Health Act, and he would have gone back to a psychiatric hospital, probably Broadmoor, and he would have been there for long-term rehabilitation for many years to decrease his risk levels. And even after that, more likely than not, he would have gone to a medium secure unit for a number of years. On a separate note, if this was a murder case, and let's face it, it was pretty close, right? Then there's another potential psychiatric defence, which is called diminished responsibility. And that is a partial defence. And what it does is it downgrades murder to manslaughter. And that is a whole different ballgame with its own convoluted and complex laws. And maybe in the future one day I'll do another podcast about that. So I'm coming to the end of my first ever video podcast. Thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. I'll be making a series of episodes on a range of topics related to mental illness. Some are going to be related to offending, although some are not. And in fact, my next one is not related to offending. My next episode is an interview with a freelance writer called Lucy, who's experienced severe mental illness and deliberate self-harm. And she'll be talking through her story. We'll be discussing her experience of coping with a mental illness, of being sectioned and what that entails, and also her experience of stigma, and mostly we'll focus on what life is like inside a psychiatric unit. Lucy's got a fascinating story, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. And on that same episode, after the interview, I'll be talking you through the day-to-day functioning and running of psychiatric wards and what it's like from the perspective of a patient as well as the perspective of a psychiatrist to be in that environment. Until then, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, like our Facebook page, and why don't you submit an idea for a future episode to our email, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. In the meantime, if you've got any questions or comments, or if you have any other future topic ideas that you'd like to suggest, I'm all ears. Just hit me up on social media. I hope to catch you all again sometime soon. Thanks for listening to A Psych for Sore Minds, and stay euthymic, homies.